John, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Prey podcast today.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Chris.
So, can you give myself and the audience a little background about who you are and what you do?
Sure. I work for the National Consumers League. At NCL, I am a vice president of public policy, telecommunications, and fraud, which is the world's most complicated long title. But what I spend most of my time doing is running a campaign we have called fraud.org, which has been around since the 1990s. And it's all about educating and empowering consumers to spot the warning signs of fraud and avoid becoming victims. In addition to education, we also work with more than 200 law enforcement and consumer protection partners to share the complaints that we get from consumers. And then we also advocate on their behalf in Congress and in state legislatures and before federal agencies for policies that better protect us. Because I think this fraud is a problem that we are not going to consumer educate ourselves out of.
No.
It's going to need stronger consumer protection laws. It's going to need businesses to be incentivized to do the right thing to make sure that their services don't get misused by scam artists. Um, in addition to that, I also do a lot of public policy advocacy on behalf of consumers, everything from financial services issues to data privacy, data security legislation. And then I get to work on fun projects like, why does buying a ticket to a concert cost us so much money? And figure out what to do about that. I wear a lot of hats at NCL, but certainly, working on fraud issues is one that takes up the lion's share of my time.
That's cool. So, was there an incident of fraud in your life or in a family member's life that got you interested in kind of consumer advocacy in the fraud realm?
Not really, not one specific instance. I've been doing consumer advocacy now for over 20 years. And so I joined NCL back in 2008, and the Fraud.org program had been started by a predecessor of mine at the organization. And so I took over the program from her and really tried to make sure that we were keeping up with sort of the never-ending sort of new twists on old scams that we were seeing, new scams that we'd never seen before. Unfortunately, as I probably don't have to tell your audience, fraud is an area where there is no lack of innovation
Yeah.
on behalf of the scam artist. So there's always something new to warn consumers about, something new, some new way that they are misusing, like for example, payment platforms that we need to look at to government regulation to fix sometimes by putting pressure on the companies themselves to do the right thing. That's all part of sort of a day-to-day job for me at NCL and as the director of fraud.org.
That's cool. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the peer-to-peer payment platforms. That's hard to say.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of what are they, how do they work, and then how are they being abused for fraudsters' benefits?
Sure. So chances are, if you're like most consumers, by now you've probably already uh, Venmoed somebody some money to split a bar tab. Venmo is just one of the most well-known peer-to-peer, or they're also known as P2P payment platforms. And basically, what they exist to do is to facilitate instant or near instantaneous payments between individuals. They have experienced explosive growth over the past 5 to 6 years, particularly during the pandemic, as people have, not wanted to do things like exchange cash between each other.
Hmm.
You've seen apps, including like Venmo, Blocks, or it used to be called Square, but Square's Cash
Hmm.
app. There's also PayPal's Friends and Family, and the banks have their own product called Zelle. Um, and all of these different products exist basically to do the same thing, like I said, to facilitate the exchange of money between people. That's sort of the peer to peer.
Hmm.
We're also seeing businesses increasingly accepting payment via these P2P platforms as well. And unfortunately, the very things that make these services attractive to consumers, the fact that they are instantaneous, for the most part, they're free to use, they're easy to use, often based on mobile apps. That also makes them very attractive to scam artists. Having worked on this issue for as long as I have, it's always interesting to see how scammers ultimately glom on to one payment mechanism over another. So when I
Hmm.
started this work back in 2008, sort of the number one payment method that scammers uh, asked to get paid by was through Western Union or
Yeah.
MoneyGram,
Yeah, that
and
was
they would
that was the one that's been around for 20 or 30 years as the fraudster
exactly.
payment method of choice.
Right, exactly. And you could easily see why the transfers were nearly instantaneous, almost irreversible. And on the other end, the scammer got cash in hand, which is ultimately what the vast majority of scammers want. They either want to get either money itself,
Hmm.
merchandise that they can turn into to cash, or information that they can sell for money. And so, the regulators like the Federal Trade Commission ultimately started cracking down on Western Union and MoneyGram for not doing enough to do things like train their agents or spot agents who might have been in on the scam. And once that happened, we started to see them get a little more stringent about who they allowed to send money through their system. Well, the scammers quickly realized this too, and they started moving on to other payment methods. They're still using wire transfer, but for a while they were going to these cards called green dot cards, or they
Hmm.
were, net spend was I think the name of the entity behind them, and they were basically reloadable prepaid cards. And so that became sort of like the new hotness among scammers to get move money around. They would get consumers to go to stores, buy these cards, put on hundreds of dollars, and then give them the code off the back. Same story. It sort of became a lot of complaints involved NetSpend, the CFPB and the FTC got involved, and the green dot card started to kind of go away in terms of a payment method. And so what we saw after that was we started to see gift cards become the big thing. I remember the day my colleague who handles all of our incoming complaints came in and said, John, a lot of people are being asked to pay with iTunes gift cards. I totally don't understand this. And I said, that doesn't make any sense to me either. But, we got in touch with Apple. We got in touch later with Amazon and Target and all the other gift card providers and found out that, yeah, indeed, this is a way that scammers are asking to be paid. They were telling consumers to go to retail outlets like CVS or Target or grocery stores, put hundreds of dollars on these cards and give them the code off the back. And so that continued for a number of years. It still continues today, but now what we're seeing are these P2P platforms becoming really a payment method of choice. And as with from all the way from wire transfer to today, the reasons are mostly the same. Um, Nearly instantaneous payment, easy to turn it into cash or merchandise that can be turned into cash, and nearly impossible to stop the transaction
Hmm.
once it's happened. So this is why I think we are really raising the alarm, along with lots of other organizations, that more needs to be done to make sure that these payment platforms actually make security as much a priority as sort of making sure that they have lots of transactions. Because at
Hmm.
the end of the day, that's how Venmo and Zelle and other P2P platforms make their money, is by having large numbers of transactions going through the system. It's like fractions of a cent each transaction, but over billions of transactions, you can see how they would make money doing this.
Yeah. So how does using like Zelle or Venmo or Cash App, how does that differ from, let's say, like a credit card transaction?
So the difference between there's a number of ways that they're different. Number one, in a credit card transaction, there are actually three parties involved. There's the sending bank, or the issuing bank.
Hmm.
That's basically, if I have a credit card, that credit card is issued to me by Bank of America. That's the issuing bank. There's the merchant that I'm using the credit card at. Let's call it, say, Best Buy, where I go to buy, let's say, a TV. And then there's Best Buy's bank, which is
Hmm.
the receiving bank. And so when I swipe my credit card, my bank tells Visa that John wants to spend $100 on a new TV. Best Buy gets the okay, gives me the TV, and then the money transfers probably through Visa again to Best Buy's bank.
Hmm.
So there are three parties, and Best Buy, at the end of the day, is the one who holds a lot of the risk. Not only are they paying a fee for that transaction to the credit card networks, but if it turns out that it's not actually my credit card I was using, it's one that I've that I've stolen from somebody or somehow compromised to buy online, then what will happen is that when the fraud is discovered, the actual credit card holder, whose balance just got rung up by this card, will dispute the transaction, be made whole,
Hmm.
and then Best Buy will have to make the banks whole, right?
Yeah.
So the merchant carries a lot of the risk in that situation. In a peer-to-peer transaction, on the other hand, you really only have two banks. You've got my bank that I'm sending the money from to the bank of the person who I'm sending the money to.
Hmm.
So there's no vendor in the middle or merchant in the middle who really bears the risk. Consequently, what that means is that I, as the account holder, am the one that bears the risk. And so if I end up sending money to a scam artist, let's say $500, to somebody who made me think that if I send them $500, I'm going to get a big prize, or they're impersonating the IRS, or some other reason that I need to send the money, I send the money through Venmo. It shows up in their account automatically, and then they quickly turn that into cash. When I figure out it's fraud and I call my bank to dispute it, the bank says, "I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do about that."
Yeah.
And the reason they can say that is because there's a loophole in the law. Um, so let's go back to my first example with the credit cards. The scammer gets a hold of my credit card, uses it to ring up a bunch of charges. And then I figure out later on, usually because I saw a fraudulent charge on my bill, that there was fraud going on. That transaction was never authorized by me. It's just somebody who got my credit card number, and I dispute it. And I'm going to be made whole by that,
Yeah.
by my credit card company. And that happens not out of the goodness of the credit card, my bank's heart, but because they're required to do so under one of two federal laws. One is the Fair Credit Billing Act, or the Electronic Funds Transfer Act. And which most of the banks have sort of taken even further, rather than just sort of $50 liability limit, which is what the law establishes. They say there's zero liability,
Hmm.
right? Consequently, we all feel very safe using our credit cards. We use them for practically everything.
Yeah.
Um, but in the case of peer-to-peer, because I am being convinced to send the transaction to a scammer of my own volition, it's considered an authorized transaction, even though it's for fraudulent purposes. And so it's not protected by federal law. And so the banks say, sorry, you're out of luck here. There's nothing that we have to do. And so it's the consumer who's left holding the bag. And the problem with that is that when that fraud occurs to an individual like me, a $500 fraud can be the difference between making rent or not,
Yeah.
right? Whereas in the credit card space, fraud, the risk for that is dispersed across all the holders of credit cards. So you can see how it's a much less secure transaction. But the fraudsters love it because, again, there's no way for the money to stop once it's been sent. So what we'd like to do is get either law or regulation changed in Washington to basically say that if a fraudster gets in touch with me and convinces me that they're with the IRS, and if I don't send them $500, I'm going to jail. And by the way, the cops are already on their way. And I send them the money, that I will still be made whole, right? Once that happens. The banks hate this because one of the reasons that peer-to-peer has become so quickly embraced by consumers is that it's free.
Yeah.
And doing this kind of sort of insurance on these transactions would cost them money, and they may or may not have to take a little bit of a haircut on that, and they really don't like that. So we're working right now. There's the CFPB has indicated, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in Washington has indicated that they are interested in this issue. They're going to be looking at it. There's a discussion draft of legislation in the House of Representatives that would fix this. So we're making progress. But this is an issue that I think is going to go away anytime soon.
Yeah.
And that's not even to say, the next thing, which appears to be cryptocurrency, is the way the scammers are starting to look at wanting to get paid, in the future. So we're fighting this battle today.
So is kind of the common thing, even like going back to Western Union, is that there's no uh, either legally mandated dispute mechanism or no systemic dispute mechanism?
Right. I mean, you can dispute these transactions with a Western Union, or with the company that you bought the gift card from, or with with PayPal, the parent company for Venmo, but they are under no legal obligation to make you whole if you're the victim of fraud. In all of those cases, those transactions are covered are fall into that this unauthorized versus authorized loophole that I talked about.
Hmm.
So it's a fairly simple fix, but the implications of that fix on a lot of companies' bottom lines could be substantial.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of fights that happen in Washington on this.
Now, is some of this also that and I'm trying to think of through the process when I set up some of these accounts.
Mm-hmm.
Is some of the process kind of a lack of verification of who you're sending the money to? And yeah, because to me, if I were a bank and Bob walks in and sets up an account and he's getting deposited $50,000 a day in $500 transactions, to me that would be like, this is kind of suspicious. I would do
Right.
something. Are, is there an element on the bank side of these? While it's not Venmo's issue,
Mm-hmm.
it's the bank that Venmo's connected to, or your own personal bank. Is there regulation on that end that would help consumers?
There is, and that's another avenue we're looking at. There are two kinds of regulations related to the issue you just talked about. One is know your customer rules. So banks are required to obtain certain data from consumers in order to allow them to open a bank account.
Hmm.
That's one of the reasons why when you want to open a bank account, you usually have to provide some sort of identification. And then there are also anti-money laundering rules.
Hmm.
So banks are required to monitor large transactions that happen in these banks. But the scammers are very adept at this. They
Yeah.
know which banks to target that may not have the resources to monitor transactions or to be as thorough in vetting prospective customers as other banks. And they quickly learn where the weak spots are and they exploit that. So what we'll see is that scammers may have an account that they will have open for days or weeks, collect a lot of money, it'll be shut down, but then they just go and open another account.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a constant game of whack-a-mole. In other instances, we found that victims of fraud themselves become ensnared in this, becoming what we call money mules.
Yeah.
These are people whose only job is to sort of accept the money into their account and then forward it on to somebody else, or use gift card numbers to have merchandise shipped to them at their home and then reship it to somebody else. So I think what this all boils down to at the end of the day, and is the scammers are sophisticated. They're
Yeah.
sophisticated and networked, and this is all they do, and consequently, they get very, very good at what they do. And so when we hear from banks or regulators or other people who say, well, how can consumers be so stupid as to hand over, just send $500 to somebody or hand over a gift card number? Or shouldn't we just fix this by making consumers more aware of these things? I'm like, well, yeah, we should be warning consumers about that. But you're asking people who have, lives to try and fight back against this really sophisticated professional network of scammers who are out to defraud them. And, absent, smart people at the banks and at the credit card networks and elsewhere having more of an incentive to fight back against this fraud, we're never going to solve it. And the
Yeah.
risk is ultimately going to fall on the people who can least afford the losses, which is people like you and me.
So, with respect to these direct payment or peer-to-peer transfer methods, whether it's gift cards or Venmo,
Mm-hmm.
what are kind of the warning signs that consumers should be looking out for? The red flags of like, well, maybe this isn't legitimate.
Right. Well, number one, if someone is asking for payment through a peer-to-peer platform like Venmo or asking you to go out and put money on a gift card to pay them, uh, you know, that should be a red flag right there. A legitimate um, uh, business, for example, should never, ask for payment in an unusual way like that. Um, you
Yeah.
know, 99% of the time, they're going to have a merchant account set up. You can just use a credit card. Um, but I think number two is recognize that a lot of these imposter scams. They're talking about the IRS scam, but we see them come in many other flavors. There's things like the grandparent scam, where somebody calls and tells you that a loved one is, been in a terrible accident overseas and you need to send money for a doctor right
Yeah.
away. So you can there are practically limitless variations on those. The scammers are very adept at creating a sense of urgency in getting you to not ask questions, to take action quickly. And so, we really caution consumers that if you're in a situation like that, stop, take a breath, um, and think about what they're telling you. That's often a good way to avoid becoming a victim. Um, and certainly, there are many other tips. For example, if you're being told that you've won a prize, you should never have to pay money in order to get that prize. If you're being asked to pay a deposit on an apartment or a car that you've never seen with your own eyes, that's a big red flag of fraud. Um, and ask a friend. If you, I mentioned a minute ago, stop and think about this. Like, stop, ask a loved one. Just do a quick Google search on sort of what they're telling you, and then the word scam, and chances are you'll probably find other people who have been in a similar situation.
Yeah.
But like I said, the scammers are very good at what they do. They seek out people who may be vulnerable, um, and they seek to exploit that. So, they with data breaches and things like that going on, they can make their pitches sound far more convincing
Yeah.
than maybe they could have in previous years. They may know, names of relatives. They may know where you live or where you work, or the fact that you've been traveling recently, because so much of this information is available for free online or through the dark web.
Yeah.
So it's
Uh,
really kind of a wild west out there for consumers right now.
yeah, I've definitely gotten calls from to me it's obviously a scammer, but they know, it's not surprising that they might know a name.
Mm-hmm.
But when they start getting things like, well, we know your address is da 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 da, it's like, ah, man, there's just more and more data breaches out there that have exposed more enough information to make it harder to determine who's legit, and who's not.
Yeah, and I mean, and we see, for example, in sort of what are called known as business email compromise. That's sort of a broad term, but basically it encompasses people, imposters who, for example, will know that a boss is out of town,
Yeah,
and because they put on LinkedIn they're going to be speaking at a conference halfway across the country or in another country altogether, and they'll say, "Hey, they'll send, then they know who the accountant is or the person who has the authority to write checks to the organization. We had this almost happen at our organization. They'll say, "Hey, I'm in, Mexico, but I need you to. I want to do like gift cards for the whole office. Can you go
yeah,
out and buy 100 gift card, or however many, like 10 gift cards, and put $100 on each of them and give me the code off the back?" But they know that the boss is out of town. They
yeah,
know who the accountant is. The ability to make these pitches sound more convincing than ever is I think something that is truly new in the fraud world.
yeah. So I know that your organization accepts complaints on your website.
Mhm.
Are there kind of new scam trends that you're starting to see arise?
Yeah, I mean, I think the cryptocurrency angle is one that we're really starting to key into in terms of where we're putting our resources to educate consumers. What we've seen is that as things like Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies have exploded in value, interest, particularly among younger consumers,
Hmm.
in sort of crypto coin investments, for example, has really gone up. And consequently, we've seen a lot of scammers who are trying to take advantage of this by running ads promising, risk-free, investing if you just sort of put your money into their trading platform.
Yeah,
Well, the trading platform ends up is bogus, and any cryptocurrency that you purchase through it, you then can't get out. So there's a tremendous amount of fraud in the cryptocurrency space, um, and we're looking for ways to sort of help consumers understand this because, when all you see, I mean, obviously this has changed in recent weeks,
yeah.
but when one Bitcoin is at $20,000 and going up, it's easy to see how consumers' resistance to scams involving that might decrease.
A-
Um,
and particularly when there is a history of cryptocurrencies having extremely high rates of returns for periods of time.
Right.
It's not unusual for cryptocurrency to fluctuate 20, 30% over the
Right.
course of weeks or months. And so when a scammer says, "Oh yeah, you can get 10%," oh that seems reasonable.
Yeah. Particularly at a time like now where we've seen scammers who are keying into economic anxieties about inflation,
Hmm.
about potentially a pending recession. We saw this in 2007, 2008, where things like gold buying scams suddenly had a renaissance because there was a lot of concern that your investments were going to be worthless, and
Yeah.
gold is the only place that you can put your money that's safe. So scammers sort of redoubled their efforts to get people to invest in bogus gold EFTs or things like that. Um, so these trends do tend to follow the news cycle, and because inflation has been at the top of the news cycle for months now, the scammers are definitely keying into that.
Are there any other kind of unusual scams that are on the rise?
I think those are the ones I think we're paying the most attention to. While there tend to be sort of new twists and old scams, they do tend to follow a pattern.
Hmm.
But I'll tell you one thing that is sort of frustrating to me is I often get questions like that, sort of what's the new scam or what are the top scams you're hearing about now? And that points to, I think, a larger problem in the fraud space, which is actually tracking like the data,
Yeah.
how do you know what's the big problem? And because there's so many organizations out there that track this, that have different methodologies,
Hmm.
who may be wanting to sell you some sort of cybersecurity solution to go with, their data is supposed to make you scared about. The estimates are really all over the map.
Hmm.
Um, you know, I consider one of the gold standards to be the Federal Trade Commission's annual Consumer Sentinel reports. Those have consistently shown that imposter scams are rapidly increasing,
Hmm.
um, particularly during the coronavirus pandemic, as people have been isolated. Their ability to connect to wider social networks to sort of vet uh, the solicitations they're getting has decreased. So imposter scams have certainly become an issue we see there. But at the same time, even that gold standard report at FTC is based on self-reported
Yeah.
complaints. If you actually survey a representative sample of consumers, you might get a different answer. So it's really, I think, um, one of the challenges in this space is getting consistent data.
Yeah.
um, but I think one of the things we're trying to do as well, and we're not alone in this. I have colleagues at groups like AARP who are on the same mission too, is really changing how we talk about fraud victims. So if you have a chance after this podcast and you want to listen to another great event, my colleague Kathy Stokes, that's a KATHYSTOKES, at AARP, has a fantastic TED talk about how we're talking about fraud victims. And what she does is look at headlines in the newspapers and
Hmm.
websites about fraud victims. And they often say something along the line of, local grandmother duped out of $10,000. And what a headline like that does is it says, number one, it's focusing on the victim
Yeah.
and insinuating the victim's culpability with a word like duped. That's how we often talk about fraud and fraud victims in this country. Unfortunately, it's almost often, how could you be taken in this like this? Why were you so greedy to go along with this? How could you be so stupid? When I think the right way to think about fraud is to focus on the criminals and the crime.
Yeah.
So we're really trying to change how the media talk about fraud, not just because it's the right thing to do, but we hear constantly from fraud victims that when they go to the police, as we advise them to do when they're victims, the police either say that's not a local police matter. We don't have the people to deal with that. Why did you do it?
Yeah.
This is a civil matter. None of which are helpful to the victim in their process of being made, of recovering from that crime. Um, And we see that prosecutors don't give it the fraud the same resources and priority that they should, given what we know to be the extent of the financial losses that happen from fraud. And so by changing how we talk about victims, we're really trying to change how we deal with fraud in this country, from one where it's easy to blame the victim
Yeah.
to one instead where we treat it as the multinational organized crime that it actually is.
Yeah, I think about it when you frame it with the understanding that a lot of uh, the scams are run as a well-oiled, well-funded, well-educated, extremely well-trained. It's a business. It's not some, for the most part, it's not some guy sitting in his mom's basement just dialing random phone numbers, hoping he can get a little bit of money out of somebody. But they got playbooks, they've got flow charts, they've got their weekly training sessions on how to be a better scammer.
Yeah, I mean
It's not surprising that people fall victim to it.
yeah, you go on some of these carding forums on the dark web, where they sell compromised credit card numbers, for example, and these guys will actually advertise 24/7 customer service to people because they know that they're it is that professionalized a marketplace,
Yeah,
but it's ultimately also a criminal enterprise. When I started doing this work, the top scam we were hearing about was the so-called Jamaican lottery scam, where you were told that you had won, had a big lottery winnings, or you'd won the Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes, and all you had to do was send $100 for taxes
yeah,
to collect it. Well, a lot of that was coming out of Jamaica and other Caribbean nations, and they had lists of people in the United States that they considered to be vulnerable to these kinds of scams. And we actually saw reports of gangs in Kingston who were literally killing each other to get access to these lists, which just tells you, how not how lucrative it is that they were
yeah,
willing to commit murder in order to get this information. But just how it is that organized.
yeah,
And I think one of the reasons it can be that organized and that blatant to the fact that, as you said, there are seminars on how to be a better scammer, is because it's so low risk.
yeah,
From time to time, we'll see law enforcement do sweeps in places like India or West Africa or in the Caribbean. But for the most part, I think the scammers know that it's a crime that they're probably not going to go to jail over, which is why you see them being so organized and blatant. Sometimes we've even seen call centers in South Asia where there's sort of a legit side of the business. They're doing real call center work for real companies, and then there's the other side where it's just a total scam, and they can get away with both of them with impunity.
yeah. I mean, and that's I think that's the hard thing to explain. The people that have approached me over the years is that if the person's overseas that has scammed you, the likelihood of you getting your money back, not to say that you shouldn't report it, but the likelihood of getting money back is pretty slim.
Yeah, and I think that is true. And the solution to that, at least from our point of view, is to make sure that the entities who are facilitating the transfer of that money overseas have more skin in the game
Yeah,
to spot and catch and prevent that fraud and to remedy it when it happens. Right now, unfortunately, what we see far too often is that the first incentive of companies that are in sort of the money transmitter business, whether they're P2P or gift cards or whomever, is to make sure that there's nothing that gets in the way of those flows. We talk to them a lot about friction, like
yeah,
that. We don't want to create too much friction because that'll slow down the number of transactions that are going through our system. Um, and I think the reason that is a business incentive for them is because, frankly, the lack of regulation.
yeah,
The reason that credit cards are the way they are now, we use them to pay for almost anything, is because they are a trusted payment method, right? And they're a trusted payment method because we know if somebody gets a hold of them and uses it to run up unauthorized charges, we're going to be made whole.
yeah,
And so I think, while taking steps to make P2P or gift cards transactions more secure may involve costs, and it will. There's really no way around it. I think from the banks, we're trying to help banks and other actors in that ecosystem understand is that if you don't take action, you're just decreasing consumer trust. So
Yeah.
you might be helping your business in the short term by resisting these reforms, but you're hurting long-term consumer confidence in your business. So if you want to have, a P2P environment that people are comfortable using for decades to come, like they are with the credit card space, it behooves you now to think about how do you make it as safe as possible.
Yeah, I think the philosophy that I've always taken and tell people is, you treat peer to peer these cash apps the way that you would cash,
Yeah,
in a sense that you only give the cash in your pocket to your friends and your family. You don't just give it out to random people, you know,
yeah, it's
that
a
that
great
you've
tip.
never met in person before.
Yeah, it's a great tip. I mean, I would go even further and say, don't use these apps for anything but sort of splitting your bar tab or, paying the babysitter, like somebody that you have physically laid eyes on, and that and you can reach out and touch.
Yeah.
Like anything beyond that, just because of the lack of consumer protections, is an invitation to fraud.
Is there risk beyond because there aren't the consumer protections in the transaction? Um, is there an increased risk of lack of protection kind of at the bank level that if Zell's probably a bad example. If Venmo gets compromised
Mhm.
and starts issuing unauthorized transactions, is there protection against that sort of thing?
Well, if let's say that your Venmo account gets hacked and somebody starts sending out, payments to their buddy overseas, then chances are you will be protected under federal law because if you did not authorize that
Mm-hmm.
transaction, you will still be made whole. So, but what I think we see more often than that is when it's a social engineering attack.
Yeah.
Consumer is incented to send the money of their own volition, even though it's pursuant to fraud. And in those cases, it's not covered. Um, another instance where it wouldn't be covered is, for example, if you send it to the wrong person. So, Venmo's gotten better about sort of verifying who you're sending it to. But for a while, all you really needed was either a phone number or an email address
Yeah.
to send money. And so if you just mistyped into your app and sent money to the wrong person, Venmo's advice was reach out and ask for your money back, which isn't, there may be kind-hearted people who will give you your money back, but there was no obligation that they do so.
That's like going into the grocery store asking for the store manager and saying, "Hey, I dropped a bunch of 20s on the floor. Did anyone turn them in?"
Right, exactly. That's it. That's a great analogy.
No one. I have no idea what you're talking about. I didn't get any money. I don't have Venmo.
Right, right.
I mean, I. So is there kind of, if it's not someone that you know in person,
Hmm.
I have a backstory to this. If it's not someone you know in person, but you have reason to believe that they are a legitimate entity, but but you're not necessarily sure that you've got the right phone number, the right email. Is there a way to do kind of a test transaction?
I mean, I suppose you could, some de minimis amount of, 50 cents or something like that, just to test it out to make sure that the right person is getting the money that you're trying to send to them. But I hesitate to say that
Hmm.
just because, I think for the vast majority of consumers, uh, the safest way to use these P2P platforms is really just to send it to people that you've
Yeah.
met in person. There's so many ways for scammers to impersonate other people, and to get you to send money, without doing all the vetting that you need to. That a legitimate business should be willing to accept payment in some other way,
Hmm.
if they really do want your business. And if they're not, then maybe you should consider shopping somewhere else
Or pay cash.
or pay cash. Don't send money. Don't send cash through the mail, though. We definitely hear from consumers who are convinced to do that, to put it in a magazine, put it in an envelope, and send it off to a scammer. But you obviously, cash. There's no way to get your money back if you
Yeah.
send them cash.
Well, it's the philosophy. Anytime someone's asking you to do something that's outside of the norm of business,
Yeah,
If they've overissued a refund, well, fine,
right,
just reverse the charge. You can do that from your side.
right, right. Yeah, no, it's, I mean, you're absolutely right. A legitimate business, asking for payment in an unusual way is one of the biggest red signs of fraud, red flags of fraud.
And so, as we wrap up here, are there any resources that you guys offer, and where can they
Yeah,
find them?
definitely. So our website is www.fraud.org. That's FRAUD.org. We have over 150 pages of content on frauds and scams of all kinds there. So I would invite your listeners to check it out. Share those pages widely with your friends and family. And also sign up for our fraud alerts. So we do a monthly fraud alert email that goes out. It's often tied to trends that we're seeing in our fraud data or that are being reported from other folks' fraud data. So, for example, we just sent one out today about rental scams. So, with lots of students heading back to college and getting rental housing, along with just the general fact that in many cities, LA, for example, the rental market is extremely hot.
Yeah.
There's a lot of incentive to put down money for an apartment before you may have seen it. And that's a great opportunity for scammers who put up, ads on or listings on Craigslist, for example, for a, 3 bedroom, 2 bath, condo in downtown Malibu for $1,200 a month. Um, definitely is one where we're using this opportunity to warn consumers about.
That's awesome. And can they find you guys on social media?
Definitely. So our Twitter is at NCL_tweets. We're also just look us up on National Consumers League on Instagram and LinkedIn and Facebook. So you can get all of our information there too.
Awesome. John, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Pray podcast today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.